All right, we are in a record shutdown right now, partial or otherwise. Never in the history of this country has the government been technically shut down, or at least a quarter of it shut down for so long, 22 days. And if my last guests were right, this could drag on a while to make it a tough record to beat. But time and again in this post-World War II phenomenon, it has happened under Democratic and Republican administrations. So this is a fairly recent phenomenon. It really came to life back in the mid-1990s, 95, when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich were going at it. Some historical perspective on this crisis in turbulent times from the woman who wrote the book on it, Leadership in Turbulent Times, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Doris, very good to have you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Neil.
I was thinking of this in some of the people you write about, including in this book, Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, but especially Abraham Lincoln, with states seceding from the country just as he was taking office and through his early days in office. Imagine if another headache would be a government just going kaput, shutting down. What then?
It's an impossible thing to imagine. I mean, it's true that Abraham Lincoln would have used any power, and did, in order to keep the Union together. He used an executive order to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, claiming as military necessity, but then he knew once the war was coming to an end, he needed to get a constitutional amendment to enshrine it forever in our history. But the idea of shutting down the federal government when you're in the middle of a war, when you need every single aspect of the federal government to be mobilized and working for you, you need loans to be, you need contracts to have horses kept and uniforms built. You need the mail to keep going as the form of communication to the soldiers. I mean, there's no way that that government wasn't an absolute instrument in his keeping the Union together and eventually emancipating the slaves. It's become, as you say, a partisan football in these last years in a way that it really wasn't in the 19th century. They did declare national emergencies then, and that's what we thought and may still happen for President Trump. But the idea of shutting down the government seems to me a very unnecessary way to get your way. Why don't they just work it out before they do have to come to this moment where innocent people are being hurt?
Well, that's too obvious. So just stick to history
course,
here.
much
We'll
too
follow
simple.
the human emotion here. You know what's interesting, too, but to your point, Doris, this idea that a national emergency can be used to justify a lot of actions. It sometimes might be a leap. Many criticized, particularly Republicans at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, from a number of measures he took as soon as he assumed office, including a national bank holiday to deal with the financial crisis. Some said that was a leap, but he used the emergency of what was going on in the economy and outright depression to justify that. This president is saying what's happening at the border is a crisis, but the numbers don't always support him. In other words, penetrations through our border are actually, ironically, and this could be a nod to him, down. So that's actually improved under his stewardship. So does he have justification if he wanted to pull the emergency trigger to do so?
Well, I think the most important thing is if you're going to use national emergency, it's a big deal to use it, then you really have to persuade the American people that this is a crisis that demands those extraordinary powers that a president is using. You know, when FDR called a national emergency in May 27th of 1941, it was because the war in Europe was going on, and he was certain it was a threat to the United States. But many people in the United States still were isolationists. They didn't want anything to do with Europe's war. And he used an address to the nation, a 50-minute address. That's what President Trump would have to do if he's going to persuade people. He worked on that address for 5 days ahead of time, and he was able to persuade the people that what was going on was a war for domination, that the Nazis were a threat to the United States, and he should therefore, even before Pearl Harbor, have national powers to force companies to make tanks and weapons and airplanes, to increase the size of the Navy and the Army. And after that address, people's changed their opinion. He educated the country. That's a president's responsibility if he's going to use this huge power.
But the facts would then have to back you up, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who don't deny that we have certain problems at the border here, but whether the wall is the answer is in the eye of the beholder. Many of the president's fiercest advocates say he's absolutely right, and there is a crisis there, and these caravans and a new one forming is evidence of that. Others, as critics say, it should be part of comprehensive immigration reform, but that has failed under Republican and Democratic administrations and Congresses alike. So what are we left with?
Well, I think we're left with a situation that it's a very difficult thing, then, to call a national emergency if you don't have the facts on your side, if you haven't been able to persuade the people, excuse me, that what you're doing is necessary for the country's security. then what should have been done in these last 2 years, there was a possibility of a DACA agreement and a border security, and there seemed to be agreement on both sides, and then it never got signed, it never got changed. They decided, oh, no, we're not going to do this. I mean, that was the answer all along, but the problem now is, and I understand where the Democrats are coming from, they're still for that probably, but they don't want to have to use a shutdown as the means to get that. So that's the impasse we're at. They're saying, get the country back together again, have the shutdown ended, and then maybe we can talk about this situation.
But, you know, there is some great power.
I don't see how either side changing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Doris. There is some power to the bully pulpit, though. Teddy Roosevelt, you're right about, was very, very good at that, using the persuasive forces of the presidency to go after, meat packers, to go after those who were, violating our health standards. He didn't have that power, technically, but he humiliated or embarrassed them and used the power of his office to get that. Is there some lesson in there for this president?
Well, I think the lesson for President Trump now is he does have a State of the Union coming up, and it didn't work in the national address that he gave last week. In fact, because he was talking about it being a fundraiser for the Republican Party, he lost the power of the bully pulpit to persuade the whole people, not just certain people. So if he's going to go forward with a national emergency, then he better make sure that that joint session of Congress speech uses facts that are clear, makes a point that can be made, and that is persuasive. And the majority of the people will then say, yes, we need this. If he can't make that argument, and I'm not sure he can, given the facts of what the situation is, then it's a much harder thing to call a national emergency without the bully pulpit behind you. That's your real power, is the bully pulpit to persuade the country that you need to take these extraordinary powers that you normally wouldn't have, because people don't want that to happen. In fact, that's what's happened too often. Congress has ceded too many of these national emergency powers to the president, and willy-nilly we haven't described very well what a national emergency means. So unless you can persuade people that it really is necessary at this time to have the president take powers away from Congress, then it's a really bad thing for the government and for the historians to look back on it for having it been done.
Yeah, I'm reading a future Doris Kearns Goodwin book here. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Happy New Year, Doris. Thank you very much.
Oh, always glad to see you, Neil.
Same here.